to the next part of our series. As you can see, or hopefully you can tell, we've got a first coat of gloss on. These two coats should be painted on separate days. I did mention it in the other part of the series. If you should drip black gloss onto a red surface and both surfaces be wet, you can't wipe one away from the other and you will end up staining it. Even though you're going to machine it the next day, you'll probably find you'll have a black spot that you just really can't get rid of. So always try and paint them on different days. It looks like we've got a coach line disappearing down the side of this panel. That tape's going to be removed very shortly, and the bulk colour coming up here is grey, and that'll just butt up to that. And we'll actually paint this panel probably later today, and we can show you how that looks and what goes on. The process we're going through this morning and how we would always progress from boat to boat, I'm going to machine these down now, and all we're looking to do is just flat them off. I'm not looking obviously to remove much product. I just want to make sure I've got a good key for the next coat to go on. Now I use a fairly professional piece of kit. They're readily available. You may even be able to hire one of these. I've never tried, but it's possible. It's a Merkur orbital sander, but the advantage of something like this for me is when you're working on a delicate surface like a gloss surface, it's just fingertip control. I can just move over this. There's hardly any weight in the machine. It's not like I'm holding the weight of the machine and then applying it to the surface. This is nice and gentle. It's got a very wide band of speeds to use. I use it running nice and slow. Excellent dust extraction, which also achieves an anti-clogging system, so we're not getting paint build up on the discs that we're using. Now you don't have to use these. For the first part of my painting career with Narrowboat, I didn't use these. We just use the ordinary Bosch sanders, and you just have to be a little bit more careful perhaps. It's just a heavier machine and you're inclined to push, which you don't need to do. Always let the abrasive do the work. And that goes through for whatever you're sanding. Let the abrasive do it. If you don't feel that you're actually getting the product off, if you're flatting down, then go to a stiffer grade. Use something that's more abrasive. If you feel it's running away with you and you're taking too much off, go to a higher grade. But also remember that the orbital runs at different speeds. So slow it down, speed it up depending, and work with the machine. It's only time and practice, and then you'll get the feel for the piece of kit you're using. Just to mention, when I sand, I will sand pretty much right up to the tape lines, but the tape is obviously at this point still a bit higher than the actual surface. We've only put on about 75 to 85 microns wet, which will have dried out probably to around about 35, 40 microns. Now that's a very thin layer. It's not that we've thinned it out, that's just how paints dry. You often hear people saying, oh, we get loads on with a brush, we get big thick layers. With paint you are still talking in microns. You're not talking about large thick build-ups of paint which you can measure with a ruler. We're always talking in microns. I've mentioned it before, I use the paint straight out of the tin. I decant it and then we apply it. I'm not a keen fan of thinning paints out. I know it's done. I've seen just recently people were talking that they were using ratios of 3 and 4 to 1 where they've thinned the paints or adjusted the paints to make them flow out. If the manufacturer required 3 coats of paint, thinning out to 3 and 4 to 1, if they're talking about paint used from the tin, not thinned. So you would actually only have applied 2 and a bit coats in reality because of the amount of thinners that have been or flowing agents that have been added to paint. So although it will help to produce a very flat finish, it extends the drying time, so it allows the paint to flow out. Remember that you might be needing more coats to achieve the thickness required by the manufacturers. I hardly ever adjust paint. It's I am working, I appreciate that, I am working in a nice warm environment, my paints are warm, I haven't got winds and breezes and things to make paints dry faster, so I can get away perhaps with a little bit more. If you feel you need to adjust the paints because you are outdoors, then try to go for the minimum amount, 5 or 10% at most. Don't go to huge ratios. It won't help you out. By slowing the paint's drying time by so much, any amount of dust or debris in the atmosphere while you're painting, you know, if your paint's taking 8 hours to dry, you've got 8 hours worth of debris going to stick to the surface. Personally, I would rather have, you know, a larger indication that it was applied by a brush, and then I've got the product on. Always remember, we paint a boat primarily to protect the steel and look after the boat, and hopefully this boat will then last, you know, 7 or 8, 10 years. If by constantly adjusting paints and reducing basically the amount of paint you're putting on, you're reducing its resilience to weather, hard winters, hot summers and so on, and the paint will break down. So as I said, it's a personal thing that we do here. We still achieve what we would like to think is a good finish, a high gloss finish, but hopefully one that lasts because we've got the product on the surface. And that comes back down to sanding now. I'm aiming to take as little off this as I can. Be aware that you don't want to use grades so high that all you're actually doing is polishing the surface, because then you're creating something that the paint can't stick to. Although you're matting the surface, the paint will have a problem in it actually adhering to the surface. So I've got a couple of ranges here. They might sound quite coarse. 320, 400, it sounds quite abrasive. But I'm going to be running that fairly slowly on a good quality machine with an intermediate pad actually on this machine as well. Now this is a very soft sponge which goes onto the head like that. We then put the abrasive on top of that, and I've got a very nice soft cushion to work with as I'm going over the surface. Now this tape is slightly higher than the actual paint, so what you'll probably see is a little area above and below there where the tape lines are that this machine or the abrasion is not getting to. Don't be tempted to start healing up the machine so that you're actually getting into that. Just come along afterwards by hand. There's a lovely product on the market called Merlon, which is like a little abrasive pad, and we can just go along those edges just to produce that key for the next surface. So I'm just going to line this pad up. We'll get an abrasive pad on, and I will show you the first stages of our sanding process. Okay, I've lined up the intermediate pad. I actually also have a pad saver on the back. I don't know whether you can see that, but there's a thin pad. That just means that stays on there permanently, so I'm always removing from above, and when the Velcro slowly or finally gives out, I can take that base layer off, replace it with another one. I've basically got a new backing pad and I can carry on. So there's the sponge. You can see that's nice and soft, and this has the advantage, should be any high spots or low spots, it'll travel over. It's also quite difficult, although I don't suspect you want to try, to actually dig in. So it's given us a nice surface to work with. We've got our mesh disc on there. I use the mesh discs because I get good extraction. Plenty of dust is going to be pulled through. The machine I've just clicked down so it's on a fairly low speed, I can always adjust it. Nice to start off slow, work up. It's going to get a little bit noisy, only because as soon as I start this, the extraction system will kick in. So here we go. Now you can see how quickly you're getting a matte surface down there. Now I've just stopped because I felt I could probably go just a tad slower, just give me more time to concentrate on what I'm doing. But all I'm doing is just matting out the surface, just smoothing it out, ready for this next coat. Now that surface, as you can see, is perfectly flat now, apart from the little bit either just above and below the line. So this is a Merlon pad, just a small piece, and all I'm going to do now, look, is just take that along that taped edge, and that's just taken the last little bit right up to the taped edge, just do it below. It's a gentle abrasive that will just mat that out, and there we have it. If you want to, you can just go over it again with a pad as soft as that. Now that is completely flat, perfect condition now to accept another coat of paint. I've taken virtually nothing off that paint whatsoever. It was a fairly, well, the undercoat was completely flat. Any little texture that we achieved or added into that when we put on this fairly thick coat of gloss, bear in mind it's not thinned, we've just smoothed out anything there and left that perfect now for its next coat. And if you do that between your coats, and a minimum, absolute minimum of 3 coats, more if you start adjusting the paint, you're going to end up with a pretty good finish. Come and join us later on, and we'll just show that application process, and if I carry on like this, I'll give you all the tips. Okay, well, we've machined down the panels that we were painting yesterday, and I've just removed that tape. That just gives you a flavour of what we're aiming for. This is going to be a lighter grey here, and it's going to butt up to this black. The grey is the next part for me to paint. So we're going to go around, make sure everything is good. One thing we haven't perhaps mentioned enough of is in the preparation, you must always, whenever you've done any rubbing down, thoroughly hoover the surface. Give it a really good hoover, go over it a couple of times. You don't want any obviously dust sticking to the surface. Now just prior to painting, and obviously this isn't going to get painted until tomorrow, just go over it with a tack rag. That'll just, this has been hoovered twice, and we just go over it with a tack rag, and that will just remove the last little bits that the hoover doesn't get. Now that's quite important. You can see it's picked up quite a lot. A tack rag is just a rag impregnated. It used to be in the old days with a bit of varnish, and it just picks up any loose bits off the surface. So just prior to painting, I wouldn't do this today and paint tomorrow. I would do it just prior to the actual painting process. Just go over it just to make sure I pick up any loose bits off the surface. So hoovered, tack ragged, then it's ready to paint. We're going to paint the grey, so I'm going to run a piece of tape down this edge, so I've got an edge to work to, and then we're going to pull in the rest of the boat. It is worth mentioning, it's not just coincidence. It wouldn't matter what this boat, how we were doing it. I always rest the paint. Once you've machined a surface, some manufacturers' data sheets actually have it on that they request that the paint is actually rested for 24 hours if you use a machine. So we've machined this, it's now going to be rested for today, and it won't get a coat of paint until tomorrow. So that's a worthwhile tip. Just people don't do it. I'm not saying that you can't get away with not doing it. I'm just saying it's there on some of the data sheets. It's there for a reason. When I looked into it and I made some inquiries as to why it needs the rest, I was told that there's a certain amount of agitation on the surface when you're sanding, and by leaving it to the following day, it allows the paint to relax. If you don't, it can cause a less than perfect finish, and sometimes it can go to the extent of actually causing crazing in the paintwork. So if your paintwork is crazed, or you can see this sort of giraffe pattern in it, it's because the paint was returning to its original point, and by doing so it's actually stretched the surface and caused these crinkles. So it's worth mentioning. I've tried to tell you as much as I possibly can about the processes we go through. Obviously we run a painting school, and we're trying to do that in conjunction with these clips. There's a big difference watching a few clips than having 2 days of my time with you working on a steel surface, painting and going through these processes. I'm going to show paint application again. You can't beat having a brush in your hand with someone standing there saying, yeah, you're doing that right, or encouraging you, or maybe just putting you right if there's an obvious thing not going so well. So, as I say, try to use these clips in conjunction with possibly thinking futuristically about coming and seeing us for a couple of days. It's worth that little bit of investment to get the finishes that we do, and you can achieve that with our help. I said on previous clip we'd just go through the application process. I've done this on another YouTube clip, but we'll go over it again. I think it's always worth having a second look. Even brush and roller. People do poo-poo the use of the roller. If you go back in time, people used to put on with a brush and then take off with another brush. It wasn't uncommon for two people to be painting the side of a van, and one guy would start with the putting on process, so he'd have a big brush, he'd be basically just getting some paint on the surface, and he'd be followed by another guy, basically with a dry brush. In those days they used to call it taking off as opposed to laying off, and he'd have an empty paint kettle, he'd be laying or taking off, wiping his brush, and following the other guy that's putting on. So all we're really doing now is using the roller in the place of the putting on brush, and we've got our taking off brush. I use Purdy's. It's just a personal preference. I know some boat painters don't like them. I've had no problems with them, so I'm quite happy to use them. The process is quite simple. We get the right amount of paint. Always remember, we're aiming for a particular thickness. We're not just trying to get on as much as we possibly can or as little. We're trying to get the right amount. And then we're going to lay it off with a brush to get a nice finish. I personally like using a roller, and certainly for somebody just starting out I would recommend it. It's easier to get the right amount of paint on. For smaller, more intricate areas, then I always tend to brush them. I mentioned earlier that if I'm doing somewhere where I can't get in with a machine, then I'll brush on primers and undercoats. So I use a combination of the two, but certainly for large areas of cabin side, just make my life easier. I've already done most of the cabin side up, so we're just going to finish off with this little piece here. I've taped up across the edge of the black so that we're going to bring this grey up to it, and I don't know whether it's showing up, but there's about a ½ millimetre of black just showing there, which is just giving me, so I'm just sure then that I've got an overlap and there's no gaps in it. Okay then, it's fairly simple. fill your roller. I like to steer clear of the edges when I start, so I get my paint on. And if you've seen me do this before, it's exactly the same as before. I make a series of squares, joining up the squares as I go. It's just, if you like, a quick way, certainly for the amateur painter. If you keep sticking your roller on straight in to where you've just previously used your roller, you will find that you tend to overload the surface. So once I've done that, we just lay it off, top to bottom, nice even coverage, and then with a roller, with a brush, I just lift up the bottom. You'll see why, and then I can come off that tape, one stroke into that bit that I've already lifted off. Okay, into there. That way I'm not wiping my brush on the gunnel and picking up any nasties that might be there. It has all been hoovered and tack ragged. There shouldn't be anything, but sometimes bending that brush into that gunnel can leave a bit of a heavy layer there. So again, just a personal preference. There are loads of ways of applying this. A lot of people will just go straight on. You can see I just favour that little square as I go. Now again, it's really just personal preference as to how you do it. You might think it's a bit long-winded, just getting on with a roller. Let's just do it. When you've had a bit of practice, I'm usually looking at somewhere in the region of about 30 to 40 minutes a side. So it's not a long-winded process, even with a roller of this size. Saw an excellent demonstration of someone using a much larger roller, I believe a bigger brush as well. Absolutely cracking finish when it completed it. You know, it's personal preference. I like to just concentrate on that a little bit more on the area I'm on, just to get that finish. Now, when you're doing this, don't worry that you can still see brush marks in it. Okay? The idea of getting it on nice and quickly and just laying it off nice and smoothly, don't rush the laying off, is that within 20 minutes or so, the paint will relax, fill the grooves that the brush leaves behind, and there won't be any. The paint will just spread out evenly, and it'll flatten off a treat. So it's still sticking to that little square idea. Notice I never put the roller on where there is already wet paint. I get onto the dry surface first, then apply it, spreading it out into those dry areas, just to stop that additional build-up. Even that little bit there that we can just knock in. Spreading it out. If you watch me paint the whole side, you would notice that I do it exactly the same every little piece we do. So there we are again with the brush, just lifting up those areas so I can get I've got something to work into. So let's just remove that, and then we're just going to run down into those areas. And those two where I've lifted up and then laid into it, they'll just marry together quite nicely. It's normally done at the bottom of the panel, so that should there be any little indiscretion, it is going to be right at the bottom of your panel. So again, that's a good little tip from when you're starting out, just to do that little lift at the bottom and then just lay off into it. And there's no reason why you can't get exactly the same result as that. So I'm going to nip around the other side and complete the job, and we'll see you next time.